He came to seek and save that which was lost. He came to save his people from their sins, but he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. He suffered tremendously, died and was buried. But on the third day, he rose again in fulfillment of the scriptures, and he will come again to judge the living and the dead. The resurrection of the Messiah from the dead was the most significant event that the world has ever seen. And what better way to teach our children about the depth of this long-awaited victory over sin and death than by telling them that a pink rabbit snuck in through the air vent of their house in the middle of the night and left baskets full of chocolate eggs and a bunch of pink Walmart crap hidden under the cushions. And then after that, after they've nearly had a diabetic seizure, you take them down to the local cathedral and observe the ancient Mass of Ishtar, the Assyrian and Babylonian goddess of war and sex. Now, does something about this seem a little strange to anyone else out there? I mean, is that a little weird? So what is this Easter deal anyways? I remember being a bit confused as a kid. I mean, what's up with the Easter bunny? What does that have to do with the resurrection, you know? Although we convince our kids that rabbits lay colorful eggs in the bushes, we know that this is not reality. This story is not as innocent and cute as many think. Where does this all come from anyways? Yeah, I don't want to make up any more fictional stories than there already are floating around out there. So let us just consult the mother of all churches and see what she has to say about all this. Easter, the English term, relates to Estre, a Teutonic goddess of the rising light of day and spring. So what does that have to do with the resurrection, the goddess here? You know, some of the other names for this ancient Teutonic mother goddess, they include Ishtar, Istre, Astarte, Ostarte, Ostera, Astereth. These are all names that originated from the original mother goddess Semiramis, the mother of Tammuz. In short, Ishtar was the wife of Baal, also called the Queen of Heaven. Wait a second. Ishtar was the wife of Baal? Baal Sabab, Satan's wife? Scholars of comparative mythology draw a parallel between the Egyptian goddess Isis and the Babylonian goddess Ishtar. Ishtar was called Astereth, or the Queen of Heaven, by the Israelites. You can read that in Judges chapter 2, where Jeremiah. This mother goddess, well known in the Eastern world, is frequently worshipped as the goddess of sex. Orgies and temple prostitutes were often used in her worship. Now, what in the world does the goddess of sex have to do with the resurrection of Christ? And if you read what the churches have to say, they'll actually admit that the Easter egg might come from ancient paganism. Oh, what a light way of saying it. Let's look at this a little bit farther. So, what is an Easter egg? What's the deal with the Easter bunny? Where does this stuff come from anyways? Well, the answers to this question, they aren't hard to pin down. The origins of these things are very well documented. All you have to do is take a couple hours, do some unbiased research in any decent library, and you'll find all these things out for yourself very easily. Here's the original Easter story in a nutshell. According to the ancient historian Josephus, Nimrod, the king of Babylon, was punished for his rebellion at the Tower of Babel by Noah's son Shem. His body was cut into many pieces and sent to the surrounding communities as a warning against idolatry. Nimrod's wife, Semiramis, the queen of Babylon, she claimed that he did not actually die, but rather ascended into heaven and had become the sun god. She, of course, being the wife of the sun, had to make herself into a goddess. I mean, that's just automatic. Now, Semiramis taught that the moon was a goddess that went through a 28-day cycle and ovulated when it was a full moon. She then claimed that she came down from the moon in a giant moon egg that fell into the Euphrates River and hatched open, and she came out the bare-breasted, Ishtar. This incident, according to her story, supposedly happened at the time of the first full moon after the spring equinox. Semiramis then became known as Ishtar, and her moon egg became known as Ishtar's egg. Ishtar, aka Semiramis, she claimed that she had become pregnant then by the rays of the sun, and then later she had this little baby, they named him Tammuz. Now here's where we meet the little Ishtar bunny. Tammuz was noted to be especially fond of rabbits. He really liked the little bunny rabbits. And they became sacred in the ancient religion. I mean, after all, Tammuz was considered to be the kid of the new sun god, now named Baal. You know, Tammuz, like his supposed daddy Nimrod, became a really good hunter. Later one day, when Tammuz grew up and was 40 years old, he was actually killed by a wild boar while out hunting. And Ishtar, being the eternal sex goddess of the sun, used the rabbit that Tammuz likes so much in her religion as a sign of sexual desire and fertility. Now, rabbits are still a sign of sexual desire and fertility to this day. That's pretty much common knowledge. We all know about that. Now, Easter, by the time her son Tammuz was killed, was worshipped as the mother of God and the queen of heaven. She continued to build her mystery religion and proclaimed this 40-day period of time of sorrow each year prior to the anniversary of the death of her son Tammuz. During this time of 40 days, no meat was to be eaten. If you want more on this weeping for Tammuz, you can read about it and what God has to say about it. In Ezekiel chapter 8, he kind of condemns it a little bit. Ever since Semiramis instituted her Babylonian mystery religion all across the world, every year on the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox, a sunrise mass or sacrifice was made to Ishtar, in which the priest of Easter would impregnate virgins on the altar at sunrise. Those virgins then became pregnant, and a year later, that next coming spring around the time of Easter, those infants were usually about 3 months old, and they would be sacrificed on the altar of Easter, and the priests would then dye Ishtar's eggs in their blood. You'd think that this practice would be dead, but it's not dead. We all know that that practice is not dead. Still very much alive and well today. The March 21st sacrifice itself to the goddess Ostara, which is another name for Easter, is still on the Luciferian and Satanic calendar of occult holidays, even to this day. Now, these sick practices are strongly condemned by the God of the Hebrew Scriptures anyways. As even the children of Israel, they got deceived into doing it for a time. But now we would never fall for something like that. I mean, after all, we've got it all figured out, don't we? Now, do you think that the apostles and the early church celebrated the resurrection of their Messiah every year by observing the feast of Ishtar? Do you think the apostles had a mass on the first Sunday after the first full moon, after the spring equinox, when Semiramis fell in from heaven into the Euphrates River in a giant moon egg? Do you think the apostles would have dyed Easter's eggs in the sacrifice baby's blood, and then have some orgies surrounded by rabbits with temple prostitutes to make new sacrifices? Then what is our excuse? The Feast of Ishtar isn't even at the right time to pretend to be about the resurrection. So how did the apostles in the early uncorrupted church celebrate the resurrection of their Messiah? Well, the same way they have been doing it since Moses climbed Mount Sinai. That's right, you heard correctly. The nation of Israel had long been observing the death, the burial, and the resurrection of their Messiah for 1,500 years before he even came to earth. God instructed his people exactly how to observe the crucifixion of his son, the burial, and his resurrection. If we would only read the scriptures that we set next to our beds at night, we would know exactly when and how to celebrate the resurrection. And then we wouldn't have to go and pick the nearest Babylonian sex goddess feast to worship in his name instead. Here's how it basically works. The Passover sacrifice, representing Messiah on the cross, was to be observed on the 14th of the month of the Aviv, the first month of the year. This just so happened to be the exact time and date that Messiah would later be sacrificed. Then, just as the sun was going down that next following evening, as it became the 15th, God instructed his people to put the sacrificed Passover lamb into the oven. This happened to occur at the exact time and date that Messiah someday would be put into his tomb. Then began the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which allowed Israel to reflect on Messiah's sinless life as he laid in the grave. It has a lot of other really good meanings too. We can't get into them all right now. Then, after that, the day after the next coming Sabbath, right as the sun went down that Saturday, then it was the Feast of the First Fruits, where the priests of Israel would go and do a wave sheaf offering of barley before the Lord. This was done at the exact same time that the true high priest, the Son of the living God, was resurrected from the dead and presented his first fruit offering to his Father in heaven. These feasts were all chronologically aligned and arranged ahead of time to celebrate precisely the death, burial, and resurrection of Messiah 1,500 years before it happened. Amazing. I mean, exactly at the same times as when it actually occurred, when it was fulfilled. So if God commands us to celebrate his son's resurrection by keeping the Feast of the First Fruits, then why don't we do that today? Why are we celebrating the Feast of Ishtar, the Babylonian goddess of war and sex, in the name of his resurrection? It doesn't really make any sense when you think about it. We, especially in America, have become so rich and increased with goods to where we now have need of nothing. Although we might still play church, Messiah himself says in his letter to us that we have become wretched, miserable, poor, naked, and blind, and that we don't even know it. Following what God has instructed us to do has historically led to enormous suffering and persecution. The early church and the apostles were so fired up about the gospel already that they weren't too worried about getting fired up by the Romans. But after more than 1,700 years of hardcore persecution, most of it by the church itself, there have been very few left that will stick their heads out and say the truth. The churches don't necessarily use their instruments of torture anymore, but they don't need to. I mean, we've become pretty well smothered by the world now. If you want to walk with what the real Lord said to do, you are very likely to walk that path with him alone. You know, I'll admit that most people have no idea about this. And my job isn't to go around yelling at people. My job is just, as a follower of Messiah, just to state reality. I just state the facts. We're supposed to just cast the seed. Some of the seed lands on good soil, and it grows and bears fruit. Some of the seed lands on rocks, and it doesn't grow and bear fruit. Some of it lands on the road. It gets taken away because there's so much traffic. You know, God defines exactly who he is with his word, his scriptures. He explains exactly what he wants from us, how he wants to be worshiped, his characteristics. And it seems like the church, by and large, has made it their job to grossly misrepresent who God is. And they constantly wrap him in this ancient paganism. And when you read the scriptures, you'll find very quickly that he doesn't really appreciate that stuff. Now, we are supposed to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the religious leaders, for they clog the doors of heaven so that no one can enter, nor do they even go in themselves. They're like blind guides, Messiah says. If you want to hand over your eternal fate to some dude in a robe who you don't even know, that's your choice. But as for me and my house, we serve Yahweh. My God is into righteousness. He's into justice, mercy. He's into love. And he is truth.